Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's lunch talk, Defending Academic Freedom. My name is Taonga Leslie, and I'm Director of Policy and Program for Racial Justice at the American Constitution Society. We're here because, as many of you might be aware, in recent weeks, the so-called Joint Force to Combat Anti-Semitism has made major and wide-ranging attacks on private colleges and universities. A few weeks ago, Columbia made major headlines when they acquiesced to major changes in governance and policy at the behest of the Trump administration, and Harvard University has made even bigger headlines when they declined. What we're seeing is a critical moment for Harvard, but also for academia in general. In response to Harvard's refusal to comply, the administration has frozen more than $2 billion in federal grants. And just this morning, the Trump administration announced another $500 million cut in federal funding. And of course, the stakes are even higher for other schools that do not enjoy the same level of funding or prestige and resources as Harvard. That's why in this moment, I'm happy to welcome Professor Andrew Manuel Crespo. Professor Crespo is General Counsel of the Harvard Faculty Chapter of the American University of University Professors. He's written about the relationship between lawyers, organizers, and social movement actors in effecting transformational change. And crucially, he's been an unapologetic voice for academic freedom and autonomy in this moment. So welcome, Professor Crespo, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone who's joining.
So my first question before we dive into the legal issues are just, how did we get here? What is the basis of the conflict between the administration and Harvard, and what are the big points of disagreement and changes that the federal administration is seeking?
Well, it's a straightforward question with a sort of long history to it, because what we're seeing right now is the explosion of a long simmering conflict between right-wing forces in the United States and higher education. We saw dress rehearsals of this in Florida during the DeSantis administration, with laws passed trying to curtail what could be taught in the classroom, with laws and policies trying to stop teachers from talking about, for example, the racial history of the United States or the ways in which race and inequality impacts all sorts of social outcomes and factors. We saw it with the attempt to and successful efforts to take over various institutions of higher learning in that state. We saw it then build in the campaign for the presidency this last time around through our presidential cycle, with the current president, when he was a nominee, saying openly that he didn't like what was being taught at American campuses, that he thought that these campuses were overtaken by woke left ideology, and that during his presidency, he would use the power of the federal government to bend these institutions to his will, most notably by trying to bankrupt them. And that's what we've been seeing play out in the first 100+ days of the administration, with the attacks you noted on Columbia, now at Harvard. I think that these are fundamentally about two main points of conflict and contention. One is ideological, and one's about power. The ideological one is, and this is something you can see openly stated by the current vice president years ago, J.D. Vance, saying that he thought that we needed to break American universities, that he thinks of universities as the enemy because he sees them as opposition to a right-wing ideological and policy agenda. I think that this attack is sort of, at its most fundamental level, misplaced in its characterization of higher education, but also has aspects to it that sort of ring true for the broader public. The parts that are misplaced are this sort of painting of these institutions as these sort of radical leftist hotbeds and bastions. I imagine we have a lot of lawyers on the call, a lot of law faculty, a lot of law students. Most people who have gone through higher education in the United States, who have gone to American law schools, as one example, I think will find it strange to see these institutions painted as sort of bastions of Marxism, where somewhere between 80 or 90% of graduates usually go and work for, law firms that are important parts of our sort of capitalist society in the country. Our law schools are training people how to go into a profession and into a society that is far from sort of, a kind of radical left structure. Harvard University is the oldest university in the country. It's the richest university in the world. And across its various schools, from its business school to its college to its law school, it's by and large sending people out into the American workforce to sustain the country as it exists, not to try to, eradicate it or radically transform it. At the same time, these are institutions that, especially as our political parties have become more and more polarized, and as in particular our Republican Party has become so much more extreme, seem out of step with the Republican Party, in part because of how much that party has changed. Just take the sciences as an example. As one party becomes a party that is the party of climate denialism, universities that hire scientists to study the empirical reality of the world will increasingly be employing people who probably don't vote for the party that denies climate change. Universities that lead the world in finding cures to diseases and new vaccines are probably going to have a disproportionate number of people who don't vote for a party that doesn't believe in vaccine science. So there is a mismatch here, but it's not that the universities are these radical left universities. It's in fact that there is a built-in set of structures here that make the Republican Party increasingly viewing universities as standing for things that the party itself no longer believes in, including things like, climate change and vaccines. But more fundamentally than that, I think this is about power. We are seeing in the first 100+ days of the Trump administration an attack on some of the key pillars of a free and open constitutional democracy. If you look at what most of the energy has been spent on by this administration in its first 100 days in office, it's been a large part of it on tariffs, and then the rest of it on attacking courts, lawyers, the free press, and universities. These are the central pillars of a democracy. These are the types of moves that you see across history and across the globe when an elected leader tries to make an authoritarian power grab. You see attacks on the institutions that are homes to the rule of law and free and open inquiry and debate. Places where dissent is celebrated, where protest is viewed as a valuable part of a democracy and not something to be shut down. You see attacks on universities in Hungary, you see attacks on universities in Russia, you see attacks on universities in countries where authoritarians are trying to hold on to perpetual power in office. And I think that's fundamentally the other part of what this is about. I think we are seeing attacks on these institutions at a moment where our federal government, for the first time in our country's history, is openly engaging in transparently authoritarian practices and attacking the institutions that could be bulwarks against them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that context, and also sort of the bigger picture of what's going on here, where we sometimes get lost in the tactics. Of course, I do want to engage a little bit with their narrative of why this is and what the disagreements are there. They prior to these cuts issued a letter of demands to Harvard for fundamental changes that they claimed would be addressing anti-Semitism issues on campus, as well as some ideological targeting issues. Could you speak to a little bit, number one, what Harvard has already done and been doing around campus climate, and also what are these changes that they were asking for, and what was the issue with that, with the reasoning why Harvard would not want to acquiesce to those changes?
No, this is a really important question because, of course, at least recently, the Trump administration has claimed that all of its actions are about trying to combat sort of rampant anti-Semitism on campuses across the country. Now, I've spent most of my career studying and trying to address racism in the United States. And I think of anti-Semitism as basically a form of racism. I think it's vile. I think it has no place in the United States. I also think that we're seeing it weaponized in these attacks on American universities. I think for many people, I can just speak to my own university, the picture painted of our campus climate feels so out of touch with the reality that we see on the ground in a way that feels so deeply distorted, and that I think is being leveled as a sort of pretextual move by the Trump administration. And I think we can see that in a couple of ways. So one thing to just highlight for folks is, our university just released 2 task force reports following, I think, maybe a year's worth of study on campus climate related to anti-Semitism and also related to anti-Muslim Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian bias. And these are, put together about 500 pages worth of reports. In them, there is some hard data about actual surveys conducted of over, I think, 2,000 people on our campus. And it's sort of striking to look at these survey results because they do, in fact, demonstrate a real presence and challenge of anti-Semitism on our campus. But also the broader context is something that I think is lost in the reporting on these findings. Because in question after question, there'll be a question like, do you feel like you belong at Harvard? Do you feel physically safe at Harvard? Do you feel like you can speak your mind at Harvard? And the respondents are broken out by different demographic groups. The folks who give the sort of most favorable answer in each of these questions are either Christian students on our university or folks who I think the category was atheist/agnostic. So, for do you belong at Harvard? I'm doing these from memory, but, something like, 80% of those groups say that they feel like they belong. For do you feel safe? Again, somewhere in the, like 80 or 90% of those groups feel safe. Do you feel like you can speak your mind? Maybe 60% of those groups feel like they can speak their mind. Across all of these questions, Jewish students answer meaningfully lower. Where the first group might say 80% feel like they belong, it's only, say, 67% of Jewish students or something like that. But the standout group across all of these surveys is our Muslim students. Massively lower reports on whether they feel like they belong at Harvard, whether they feel like they are physically safe at Harvard, whether they feel like they can speak their mind. So if you were to just actually look at the data, taking what our students and faculty and staff are actually saying in their own survey responses about the experience, your conclusion, if you just look at these bar charts, and there are these colorful bar charts in these reports, would be the standout problem that seems to be the jump out issue from the actual survey that these task forces conducted would be you have a massive problem of discrimination against Muslim students on your campus and an identifiable anti-Semitism problem. The only way this is ever described is a massive runaway anti-Semitism problem. I think that's at least a little bit of a tell that there's a sort of not the whole truth being told here. I think that what we are seeing is, look, these universities are part of the United States. The United States has and continues to have legacies of racism, of sexism, of anti-Semitism, of Islamophobia. These are realities of our society. They are things that we are constantly trying to improve about ourselves. You're not going to see a complete absence of all of those things on institutions that are central parts of the society in which they live. At the same time, I think that we're seeing a real weaponization of these things. And I think the tell that this is sort of pretextual from the Trump administration, you can see across a couple different domains. One is the letter you mentioned. At this point, I feel like the Trump administration isn't even pretending anymore that this is about anti-Semitism. What these letters include are demands that our university make changes that have absolutely nothing to do with anti-Semitism. The demand letter we received on April 11th required that said that if we wanted to continue receiving federal funding, we had to allow the Trump administration to appoint a third-party external auditor to audit every class, every syllabus, every department for ideological diversity and balance. The clear message here is that the Trump administration doesn't like what we're teaching, doesn't like what is being said on our campuses, doesn't like the research questions we're asking or the answers we are giving across a whole range of issues that, again, have nothing to do with anti-Semitism. This is about ideological control of higher education. This is an effort to try to turn Harvard University into Trump University. This is fundamentally not about anti-Semitism. It is about authoritarianism. This is an effort to control what is said at institutions of higher learning precisely because there's an ideological disagreement with some of the core principles of what we are studying. Again, I come back to things like climate change and vaccines, which have become political questions in our society these days. And as a result, you see these universities being attacked, but you also see time and again across history that universities are a major inoculation or bulwark alongside the press and the courts and lawyers against authoritarian power moves. And that's exactly what you're seeing as these attacks. And I think that you're seeing anti-Semitism weaponized in that context. And I think that that is a tragedy, not just for these institutions, but also for our Jewish students. I think it is a challenge and a problem for our Jewish community that is being flattened and made to seem narrow and monolithic. I've been to so many rallies on our campuses where our Jewish students, our Jewish faculty members, our Jewish staff members are standing up and saying, don't do this in our name. This is the portrait you are presenting of this campus is inaccurate, and you are not helping Jewish students or the Jewish people in the United States by trying to eviscerate institutions of higher learning.
Thank you so much for laying that out. And I think, there's just so much value. And number one, understanding things appropriately before we jump into action. And I also think one one question that's been coming to mind more and more in these 100 days, and even as our organization is devoted to study, is just so how, like, how does this happen, and how are they doing this? And I I'm curious about the what is the legal basis for being able to do these kind of unilateral funding cuts? The restrictions. It seems like there's two buckets of threats that the Trump administration has used. One is the funding and grant cutoffs, which are already moving on, and then they're already moving also to try to threaten the tax exempt status for Harvard. Um, and I'm just curious, the best that you can understand, what is the legal basis for these attacks? Is there any precedent for prior administrations cutting funding to universities or pulling tax exempt status in this way?
So as you know, and as I think we'll probably get to, our chapter of the American Association of University Professors has filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration to try to block these cuts, in part because we think that the legal bases or the claimed legal bases for them are so transparently thin, right? The Trump administration's basic approach here, consistent with its approach across so many other domains, is to sort of name check a federal statute and then blow past what that statute actually says or requires and just use it as a sort of, gestalt invocation of massive unprecedented presidential power. So here, one of the main statutes that keeps getting invoked over and over again is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Right? Now, many people listening will be familiar with this statute, right? This is a landmark civil rights statute that's trying to end racial discrimination in the United States. And one of the things that it says is that institutions that receive federal funding can lose that funding if they discriminate on the basis of race, national origin, ethnicity. The argument essentially here is, or the claimed argument by the Trump administration, is that anti-Semitism is covered by this statute, that there is a rampant anti-Semitism problem at these universities, and that they thus are not entitled to funding under Title VI. But here again is part of the tell for why I think that that is transparently pretextual. It's not just that the demands that they're asking for have nothing to do with anti-Semitism, but are in fact about changing how we're teaching, changing who we're hiring, changing all sorts of aspects of governance and curricular, autonomy in higher education, but also because they're not using the statute that they say is at issue. Right? One of the core sets of claims in our lawsuit is that Title VI spells out in detail the steps that the government has to take if it's going to revoke funding. And again, speaking to 150 lawyers listening in right now, it won't surprise you that that statute entails process, that there are due process requirements before you can cut off millions of dollars. And there's a reason why Congress put that process into place. It has been the policy of this country since after World War II to invest deeply in a strong partnership between the federal government and research universities across the country. That is a partnership that has had benefits for the entire country for decades and for the entire world. These billions of dollars that are being cut go towards funding research into technological advances, medical advances, scientific advances that benefit the entire globe. These are advances into finding cures to diseases, new vaccines, addressing things like climate change, driving innovation that has spurred our economy and the global economy. This is a partnership that has been essential to our country's success over the past half century and more. Congress wanted that partnership to continue, and so it put in place real protections against having this funding cut off, including, before you cut off the funding, you have to give notice of the specific charges that you are saying are being violated, the specific forms of discrimination. There then has to be a hearing where you present evidence to support the charges. The institution that you're trying to strip funding from has to have a right to show up at that hearing and contest all of that. And substantively, the statute says that funding can only be removed from the component of the institution where a violation, that is to say racial, national origin, or ethnic discrimination, has been found to have occurred. You can't cut funding from the entire university without any hearing and without any actual notice of charges, which is what the Trump administration has been doing. So they are sort of saying the words Title VI, But if they actually thought that there was a Title VI violation happening, if they actually thought that there was an anti-Semitism problem here that needed to be addressed through the legal mechanisms available, you might think they would actually try to use the statute that they keep talking about, but never actually invoking.
Now that's very interesting, and it's also it's also quite scary because of the speed at which, because it's my understanding these cuts have already sort of moved into play, right? Like funding is already being cut, um, taps are already drying up for grants. What is sort of the effect of that, and how do how do we sort of catch up to that judicially? Because of course, judicial procedure moves much more slowly than, if a check doesn't clear tomorrow, that's something you can't do tomorrow, where a case might take much longer.
Look, the effects are already severe and devastating, most especially in our science communities. I mean, I'm seeing this up close and personal. I spent this past weekend having brunch with one close friend on our faculty who's a molecular biologist and dinner with another close friend who's an evolutionary biologist. And they are seeing their field, they're seeing their profession disintegrating beneath their feet. These funding cutoffs are already happening. They are here. They are present in our lives. There is research being interrupted, and there are careers of knowledge being interrupted. You have to understand that part of what these billions of dollars do is fund research, but more fundamentally, they fund a research ecosystem. They fund the capacity of people and talent development to grow into lifelong careers as scientists. And that starts in doctoral research and postdoctoral research. These experiments can take years. Building a career, the early stages of a career, can take years. This is a meticulous planning that goes into every stage of these experiments. And when you just immediately turn off the power, you think of a massive switch and just the whole thing shuts down. There are people who now have to scramble and figure out, do I still have a job? And that's happening especially at the earliest stages of career. Doctoral students, postdoctoral students who are in the beginnings of lab work that is now getting interrupted. That's hard to rebound from. And what you are doing right now, what the Trump administration is doing right now, is essentially killing off a generation, a cohort of scientists. That's going to be hard to bounce back from, and we're going to see the effects of that for potentially the rest of our lives. That's why it is so urgent to try to fight to get this undone quickly, because we are now living at the stage where every day of this has consequences. There are lab trials, there are clinical trials. I mean, this includes individual patients. There are patients who are now being turned away from the next stage of their clinical trials because the funding is gone. So the ramifications are serious, and they are here, and they're going to snowball, and they're going to snowball quickly. And the long-term effects will be really challenging to come back from. That's why it's important for us to be trying as hard as possible to reverse this as quickly as we can.
I want to, turn to, and you alluded to your lawsuit, but one thing that's been interesting in this case is Harvard's AAUP and National AAUP actually filed the challenge before the university itself did. And I was curious to hear from you, number one, why, what was the thinking and strategy behind that, and sort of moving ahead independently and first. And if you could talk a little bit more about the kinds of arguments and the kinds of claims that you're bringing.
Sure. I'll answer the second part first. You can all, as I said, there's lots of lawyers listening. You can go read our complaint. We filed an amended complaint last week. Our core claims, I'm going to oversimplify slightly, but have sort of two main components to them. One tracks what I said before. We argue that the Trump administration claims to be withholding these funds under Title VI, and yet has followed none, zero, not even, made any effort to make a show of following the actual requirements in that statute. So it's patently unlawful what they're doing. That's an APA violation. It violates Title VI. They are trying to revoke funds that Congress appropriated using its Article I power in furtherance of a century-plus partnership with higher education across the country in a unilateral way that violates the very statutes that Congress put in place. It's ultra vires, it violates Title VI, it violates the APA because they're not following what the statute requires. Then, more fundamentally, we have a sort of set of interlocking First Amendment arguments. Because again, it is at this point nakedly transparent that what the Trump administration is doing is using threatened and actual coercive measures to try to regulate and basically stop speech on these campuses. They don't like the fact that there are protests on these campuses related to Palestine, related to issues of racial and racial justice, related to any host of issues, inequality, social inequality. They don't like that these things are discussed on these campuses. They don't like that there are people researching about them. They don't like what that research turns up, and they want it to stop. When you see a letter from the federal government saying that it wants to change the ideological composition of a faculty, of syllabi, of curricula, that is as naked of a First Amendment violation as you can get. It's the government saying, right now, you're researching about X, you're talking about X, you're studying X, you're teaching X. We want you to stop teaching all of those things, stop researching all of those things, and we want you to start saying Y. That is speech compulsion. We have a First Amendment in this country that is exactly what it prohibits: content and viewpoint-based discrimination, which is, again, transparently what is happening here. And that's the other core part of the complaint and the claims. To your question about why we moved so fast to file first. I am so incredibly proud to call myself a member of the American Association of University Professors. For folks who don't know this organization, the organization is, well over a century old and is the leading organization in the country for defending faculty and teachers in higher education across the country. Its core principles are defending academic freedom, faculty governance, and the economic security of the profession. When you think of the things that have made American higher education so successful over the past century and a half, it's in part the partnership with the federal government and the massive investment of resources into higher education, but it's also equally essential that we have had some of these defining principles of what higher education is and how it's defined, including academic freedom and tenure. A lot of people in the United States are not aware that American research universities were not the leading universities in the globe, in the last century. Germany started the modern research university, and for a stretch of time, it was German universities that were the leaders in building research and building the norms and ecosystems of the profession. In the United States, those norms were really pressed forward by the American Association of University Professors, with academic freedom being a central pillar of that. The idea being, you have to let expertise pursue knowledge where it will find it. You can't try to manage that from the top through your government, and you can't have politics dictating what will be studied or what will be researched or what will be taught. So academic freedom is a core component of what this organization, the AAUP, stands for. Our local chapter has been organizing to try to push back against threats to academic freedom on our campus over the past year and a half. Threats that predate the Trump administration, which I'm seeing some of the questions in the Q&A already get to, so I'll come back to that in a bit. But we exist on this campus to push for and defend academic freedom, faculty governance, and the economic security of the profession, including across everyone who calls themselves a teacher, whether they have tenure or not, whether they are eligible for tenure or not. We moved to file this lawsuit at a point in time where subsequent reporting from the New York Times and other outlets has made clear it was not at all clear whether Harvard was going to resist these demands. We filed this lawsuit at a point in time where, again, according to this reporting, Harvard was in active discussions with the Trump administration and actively considering acquiescing in the same way that Columbia did. We thought that it was essential that the faculty at this university, the people who I think most internalize the core norms of what a university is supposed to be about, these norms of academic freedom, of free inquiry, of letting expertise run where it needs to go, stand up, whether the university leadership was going to or not, and demonstrate this is unlawful, this is unconstitutional, and it is essential that the faculty themselves make clear that what the Trump administration is doing cannot stand. We had every hope that the university would follow suit, and as it turns out, they did. But to be entirely, candid and blunt, at the time we filed our lawsuit, that was not at all clear. And we thought that it was important that one of the institutions within Harvard that has an important role in its governance, that is to say, the faculty, stand up for the things that make a university what it is. Stand up for our academic freedom, stand up for our right to govern ourselves, free from the type of coercion that the Trump administration was threatening.
That's very very powerful and interesting and to you know maybe probe a little bit more on the because folks have alluded to in the comments this there have been academic freedom issues and questions going on campus before this, but this obviously brings a whole new timbre to it. But if you could speak a little bit to what agency and power do professors, students, members of as many of our members are of universities have in this moment when sometimes it seems like administrators will decide what goes on and I think for some people it can feel out of their control.
No, look, a lot of the last 18 months have shined some harsh lights on universities and on challenges internal to our own structures and ecosystems. We have seen the extent to which, as much as our alumni and donors are so central to us being thriving institutions, to us having the resources to do the work that we need to do, there's another side to that coin, which is that our donors can have real outsized influence if they try to dictate what's taught or how it's taught. There's a parallel there to the federal government. There has been so much of benefit to the whole world that has come from this partnership with the federal government. And at the same time, when that government becomes openly hostile to knowledge and higher education, that partnership can be revealed as dependence and as a real weakness, and then as an Achilles heel that we're seeing. We're also seeing, I think, to your point, some internal governance challenges between the fact that, the structure at many universities is that legally, these are corporations. These are nonprofit corporations that have boards of trustees. And there has been a tendency over time for those boards to be populated primarily by folks who are not of the academy. Right? Usually you don't have faculty members or people who have spent their years in academia populating the majority of those boards. And there's then at least the possibility for some real tension or gaps when it comes to the core mission of the institution. And I think that's why it is so essential for faculty to find ways to be organized together and to try to be able to act collectively in partnership, ideally, with their administrators and with their boards as part of this trio of governance, shared governance of the institution. That's one of the core pillars of the AAUP. And it's written thoughtfully about this, about shared governance between those three key actors, your administrators, your faculty, and your board, because each have something to contribute. But if your faculty don't have the capacity to be part of that three-legged stool because they either have been sort of discouraged from acting together or because faculty governance has been eroded, you lose the collective voice of the part of that ecosystem that, again, is most centrally connected to the core mission of what higher education is about. So I think part of what faculty can do is recognize that especially in these moments of stress and of external threat, our role is not just to be teachers and researchers, but also to be, importantly, stewards of the mission of higher education. That we have a role to play in defending this sector. We have a role to play in shaping the future of our institutions. We have a voice and a role in how we respond, how our institutions respond to this moment of existential threat for the profession. If faculty are silent or sitting by or acting individually but not collectively, their voice will not be heard in what is probably the most critical moment for higher education in the United States. So there are ways to actually try to have that collective voice. And that's a big part of what the AAUP does. We try to organize our faculty so that there are ways for us to be at the table with our partners in these institutions, our partners on the boards of trustees, our partners in presidents and provosts and deans' offices. We are in this together. Even if we have different perspectives on the challenges at hand. And it's really important for faculty voices to be not just sort of, in op-eds or, speaking at rallies or filing lawsuits, but actually incorporated into some of the most important decision-making that's happening for higher education across the country. It needs to be shared decision-making because faculty have a really valuable perspective on why universities are valuable in the first place.
Mm-hmm. That is really helpful. We are going to get to the comments in the Q&A soon, so please keep inserting those. I also want to give folks the first CLE word. It's inquiry. inquiry, and you can find the place to submit and the CLE documentation on the website along with this event. But one thing that you mentioned here that we hadn't touched on completely is there's two threats. There's the funding cuts, which seem to be Title VI related, and then you mentioned these are nonprofit institutions, and this threat of losing nonprofit status seems almost a more existential threat to the very core of how private universities run. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the basis for that
Yeah.
and and sort of the arguments there and what do you think the danger of that is? It's been alluded to a few times.
I think the danger is enormous, right? I mean, it's hard to say which is bigger, but they're both potentially fatal threats, right? Which is bigger? I mean, either the research funding cuts or the tax exempt. And to explain why the tax exempt thing is so dangerous, part of why Harvard is able to take this stand, and I think had a moral obligation to take this stand, is because it is the richest university in the world. It has a massive endowment that has been built over centuries, largely from the philanthropic support of alumni and others, right, who see the value of what we do here and who want to support that work. Most people who make donations and have the means to make very large donations are also thinking about their tax strategy, and they're thinking about how to give tax-exempt gifts. If Harvard is not able to continue recruiting support from folks who want to give tax-exempt gifts, I think there's a real danger of that support drying up. Look, I can speak to this directly firsthand. One of my roles here at Harvard is I co-founded and now lead a center called the Institute to End Mass Incarceration. And I've been leading that for the past 5 years. And one of the things that I was doing it today, I do it regularly, is I have to fundraise for the work that we do. We have a team. We have lawyers who are out there working on campaigns trying to address the root causes of mass incarceration. We have editors and writers who help publish our magazine, Inquest. There's a team here. It takes resources to support that team. It takes resources to grow that team. And every time that I am out asking people to donate to our work, I'm telling them, look, and this, you can make a tax-exempt gift, just like every other nonprofit and every other NGO out there. Again, here we're seeing a threat that is not unique to Harvard. There are murmurings and rumors and reporting out there about the Trump administration trying to weaponize 501c3 status across the country and trying to strip it from any organization that is engaged in work that the Trump administration doesn't want. Look, this is the same playbook over and over again. The executive orders against law firms trying to dry up their business, drive away their clients. These are weaponization of the tools of government to try to attack aspects of civil society that the Trump administration wants to break or end. And it's using the tax code to go after nonprofits, including universities. It's using the power of federal contracts and security clearances to try to break law firms. It's an across-the-board authoritarian playbook that we're seeing page after page be run through, and it is scary.
Absolutely. We will start to bring in some of these questions. One is just with this timing question, like Harvard is already bleeding funding now, and this seemingly quite unlawful or at least unprecedented assault. Why is it that it's not been possible to get something like a temporary restraining order to keep the money flowing without this damage until judges can sort out the procedural and substantive bit on this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not going to get sort of like deep into the weeds on our litigation strategy. When we filed our lawsuit, at the point where we weren't sure if Harvard was going to stand up or not, we initially moved for a temporary restraining order. At that point, the funding had not yet been cut off. Once the funds were cut off, it changed the posture in various ways. There's all sorts of sort of complicating procedural questions in the case. And we realized that we could try to litigate the case quickly. So instead of moving for a TRO, our current track is we are trying to have summary judgment briefing completed and a hearing held by July. with hopes that a judge will have an opinion soon thereafter. So we sort of moved from a kind of preliminary injunction posture to something that is really just a few weeks longer in timeline, but is going directly to the merits of the case as a way to try to get it fully litigated, fully set up, because we think our claims are so strong. The First Amendment violations here are so clear and obvious. The failure to follow one sentence of Title VI's procedural requirements is so obvious that we think that we have a strong case on the merits, and we're pushing to get it adjudicated as quickly as possible so that we can get full judicial relief, hopefully in time to save these labs, save our colleagues, save their research before this dries up. The hope, and again, Harvard is another party in this litigation, and they're at every one of these hearings now, there's our lawyers, Harvard's lawyers, and the government's lawyers. Our hope is that Harvard's strategy is aligned with ours in trying to move fast. We're on the same briefing schedule. They've agreed to that. And that part of what I'm hoping they are thinking in terms of moving fast is that they have the resources to stay afloat, for the short term. One of the reasons why Harvard had to take this stand, and again, I think had a moral obligation to do it, is if any university has the ability to try to keep its head above water while fighting off this existential threat, it's Harvard. And my hope is that the university will, in fact, use its endowment, use its resources, use its capacity to, either issue new loans or take on new debt, whatever strategies it needs to do to keep the core aspects of our university that are most under threat from these funding cuts alive and afloat until the judiciary can do its job and issue a ruling speedily, declaring these things unlawful. So that's the basic sort of arc or setup of where the litigation stands right now.
We have a question about, of course, there's a ton of pressure for Harvard to remain in talks with the administration and reach some sort of settlement to resolve things faster. There's questions about, number one, do you see that possible on the horizon? And if they were to settle, would that undercut the claims? Would that moot your lawsuit? Sort of how much does this depend on sort of remaining oppositional and not having that settlement?
This connects to your question about why we filed our lawsuit in the first place, why we pushed for it early on, and why we are still in it, right? You could imagine folks saying, oh, well, now that Harvard filed its suit, why don't you all just drop yours? And I think the reality at the end of the day is that, look, we are seeing Harvard, even following its lawsuit, both before filing its lawsuit and after, taking steps that are really worrisome, that are troubling from the perspective of academic freedom. Folks who are on the outside and not living and breathing this every day are probably not, waiting for each morning's Crimson news alert. The Crimson's our local newspaper, sort of describing the steps on the ground here. But, in the months leading up to this, the letters from the Trump administration, during the time that the New York Times reports that there were these sort of ongoing negotiations, and even in the aftermath of the suit, Harvard has done things that I think are really problematic. Harvard removed 2 faculty members from the directorship of one of the centers at our school, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, that was named in the Trump administration's letter as, a center that it wanted to impose its will on and have restructured. Harvard, after filing its lawsuit, closed its DEI office, our Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging office, and retasked the staff members to a new mission. We got an email that went across the university from the former head of our EDIB office saying, henceforth, we're going to be focused on these new issues as opposed to what we were founded to focus on. After filing the lawsuit, Harvard sent a message across the university saying that it was changing our long-standing practice that I think of as a central part of academic freedom that placed questions of student discipline under the authority of each faculty. This is important, it's a part of the norms and structure of universities that student education including disciplinary questions, are to be decided by the educators of the institution. One of the Trump administration's demands in its bullet-pointed letter was that student discipline be centralized in, a presidential office. And lo and behold, over the past couple of weeks, we've gotten a message saying that there's going to be a new disciplinary structure centralized in, boards appointed by our president, and that our faculties no longer have the final authority over disciplinary questions involving students across schools, basically over protest cases. So we are seeing changes that are responsive, actually, to the Trump administration's efforts to stifle dissent, stifle protest, and change aspects of what we do here. The Trump administration doesn't like DEI, which it thinks of as code for teaching and learning about race in the United States. It doesn't want people to teach or learn about race in the United States. It's saying you need to shutter all your DEI offices. And we're seeing, signals and steps and actions from our own administration here at Harvard that is at least partially bending to those demands. So it's a complicated picture here. The New York Times had a headline recently that said something to the effect of, Harvard's president is fighting Trump and also agrees with him. I think that the reason why our lawsuit maintains and why we are pressing it is we don't agree. We don't agree with the Trump administration's characterization of what is happening on our campus. We don't agree that it has the lawful authority to try to impose the conditions on us that it's trying to impose. And our chapter, at least, is not prepared to settle or end this litigation in a way that surrenders some of those aspects of academic freedom, because we think that academic freedom means academic freedom for everyone. Academic freedom means the freedom to have unpopular positions, the freedom to engage vocally and boisterously in conversations, including protest and dissent on these campuses. We think that's an important, vibrant part, not just of a university, but of a democracy. And efforts to chill that, whether they are externally imposed or internally arising, are problematic. And at this moment in time, it's important that they be resisted and that the core mission of higher education be protected and defended.
Certainly. I have a question here, just looking at the requirements and basis. Like, is there a process for, this is going back to the tax exemption, is there a process for, determining if institutions no longer merit their tax exemption, or if they've violated some terms of that would normally be followed? Like, do we have any precedent for how that would normally work?
So, the precedent I am most aware of, and I should say, I'm a criminal law and criminal procedure scholar who now is also basically a full-time general counsel to a higher education nonprofit, but I'm not a tax expert. But many folks listening might be familiar with Bob Jones University, which my understanding is lost its tax-exempt status back in the 1970s. Because it had policies like Black students are not allowed to date white students on our campus. This was viewed to be against the public policy of the United States, and there was a process engaged, and I believe their tax-exempt status was eventually withdrawn. But again, here too, there are processes in place. Look, we're a country of laws. We're a country of process. This is a gathering of lawyers and law students and legal scholars, with the American Constitution Society. We are a constitutional democracy. That means that we have structures in place that ensure fair play when the government is trying to do something massive, potentially existentially threatening to people in our community, including our universities. So the president doesn't just get to, tweet out or put a, announcement on Truth Social, snapping his fingers saying tax-exempt status is gone. He doesn't get to just snap his fingers and say, here's $2 billion that I'm pulling away. There are laws and statutes in place to initiate processes that have to be fact-based and actually allow for due process to run its course. The universities have a right to actually be heard on these questions and respond to actual evidence brought forth against them. What we have instead is sort of, broad, vague innuendo and tweets and letters written by cabinet secretaries that are not actually invoking the processes and the laws that are on the books. And I think that itself is so telling. If the Trump administration actually believed the allegations it was putting forward, you might imagine that it would try to avail itself of the legal options available to it. Instead, it's just barreling forward unilaterally with a massive coercive threat and now actually actions that are patently unlawful.
There are some questions because of course this has been largely used pretextually of anti-Semitism, and yet the report that you mentioned does talk about there being a climate issue perceived, and also folks in the chat mentioning, okay, so when there are incidents of anti-Semitic behavior, do you have sort of a perspective on the university's actions thus far, and if there are other methods or strategies that would make more sense but be aligned with academic freedom?
I think we have to lean into, the things that we do best, right? We have to realize that universities are learning communities. When we're confronted by challenges like this, we should be using the skills and the sort of norms and structures that we exist to promote in the world. We should be trying to deeply study the sources of these challenges, the sources of these forms of hatred, identify, why they might exist on our campus, and also try to engage in actual dialogue with each other. We should be trying to foster the capacity to speak across difference. We should be trying to recognize that when people are speaking loudly about things that they care about, that's exactly the moment where we should be leaning in and trying to listen to each other rather than shut each other up. And I think that there has to be a way to actually try to engage that. And there have been so many efforts across our campus that are doing just that, that don't get covered, in the broader news. But there are faculty members here from sort of, multiple sides and perspectives of the Middle East conflict, holding lecture series that are bringing people together and shedding real light, where students from multiple perspectives come together, hear each other, engage in conversation with each other. I've participated in conversations like that here on our own law school, and had students come up afterwards and say, thank you. This is the space that I needed. I felt like, I'm not being heard, and now I'm being heard by people, including people I disagree with. Universities are actually good at that. But we need to avoid a culture where we make people afraid to actually speak their mind. And that, I think, includes avoiding a culture where we are cracking down on protest and dissent, because that sends a broad message across the whole campus that there are certain ideas that actually you'll get punished if you say them. There are certain ideas that need to have, be given wide berth. They're too dangerous to come close to. That's the opposite of how you solve these problems. What that does is force people to retreat to their corners, retreat to their silos. I think we have to recognize that actually these questions of protest and dissent are interconnected with our questions of education. If you're going to be an educational institution, you can't be afraid of hard conversations. And you can't send the message that the response to hard conversations is to try to make everyone be quieter or speak less. You have to invite them to speak more, but then give them the structures and the support to speak with nuance and intelligence and open-heartedness and open-mindedness and care and compassion. We know how to do that. We need to lean into those aspects of our training, of our skills, of our structures and our resources, rather than what we've been doing, which is leaning into the disciplinary apparatus and the sort of speech restrictive apparatus, and issuing new campus use policies and rules that say you can't hang signs in certain windows, or you can't use a megaphone on campus. Those are all tools that are trying to tell everyone to be more quiet. And I think we need to, instead of trying to tell everyone to be speaking less, encourage them to speak to each other and to speak thoughtfully and to listen.
It, you know, it it occurs to me that the external and internal have such an internal interplay here, especially at Harvard, given the hearings, given the high profile nature of the conflicts that we're seeing on the campus. I'm wondering if you have any perspective on how this is useful, relevant, different to other universities, other colleges that don't have the same level of privilege, or vice versa. You know, what does it mean for this to be playing out in this context of hyper privilege and concentration, and what lessons can we learn, and which ones are just harder to translate?
Yeah, it's a great question. Because I think that the response here really does need to be sector-wide and even cross-sector. There's a few lessons I think you can pick out from what's happened on the attacks against higher ed over the past, 3 months and more. I mean, first, just for context, Harvard and Columbia were two institutions on a list of 60 that the Trump administration set out as its targets in this sort of campaign. So there are 58 other institutions, and some of them have already had funding cut. The Trump administration has focused so far on, large Ivy League or, well-resourced institutions. But its attack can continue and roll out across the whole sector, because I think, as to tie back to where I started, I think this is really an attack on higher education writ large. One of the lessons from this saga has been the lesson of Columbia itself, right? And I think that that was in many ways potentially an instructive one for Harvard. Columbia, famously capitulated to the demands, and did not get its funding back. In fact, it capitulated to the demands and then was met with more demands. And I think that's a critical lesson for not just higher education, but for all of the institutions that are facing these sorts of threats. People sometimes think that acquiescence will be some form of salvation. And in reality, when a bully punches you in the nose, if you don't stand up for yourself, usually you get punched again, and you keep getting punched until you stand up for yourself. But the other key lesson here is that, look, the federal government is massively powerful. It's probably the most powerful institution in the entire world. Even wealthy, well-resourced, famous institutions like Harvard are not more powerful than the United States government. The ways in which these institutions have a hope of standing against this onslaught is to actually do it together and sector-wide, and then across sectors. I think of, being a law professor, I think of law firms a lot in this moment, because we saw something play out in parallel at the same time that we were seeing the attacks on higher education. Columbia capitulated, as did Paul Weiss, right? There were then universities that stood up, and there were law firms that stood up. Perkins Coie, Wilmer Hale. We're seeing that it is actually possible to demonstrate moral courage in these moments, and that when people demonstrate moral courage and when institutions demonstrate moral courage, they are met with massive support. They are met with a chorus of people saying, thank you for doing what you're doing. And also, they are usually met with other institutions joining in, right? Once some law firms started standing up, other law firms took a stand. When Harvard said that it was going to resist and filed its lawsuit, you then saw a statement from, dozens and dozens and dozens, scores of university professors saying, we stand with Harvard. There can be turning points and inflection points, but they have to cascade into broader sector-wide solidarity. And I think that that's the critical path forward. The hope is that courage inspires more courage, but that it also inspires coordinated defense and action in the face of what's coming.
I'm curious, and this may be my last question. You've talked a little bit about, of course, the faculty on campuses. It sounds like there's a role for them to play, maybe organizing, maybe checking out AAUP. I'm curious if there's other types of support that would be helpful for you to this moment. Like what do you need from the folks on this call? One questioner asked, would it be useful for Jewish organizations to submit amicus briefs? So that's one offering, but just what kinds of things would be most useful in this moment in the battle you're in?
So two thoughts come to mind. One is directly in response to what you just said. Yes, I think those types of amicus briefs would be incredibly powerful. For obvious reasons, right? If I'm right that anti-Semitism is being weaponized and used with ill intent by the Trump administration here, there is moral authority from the Jewish community, and I can just say that I've seen that happen, right? I have seen the reaction when my Jewish colleagues or Israeli colleagues write op-eds saying, again, not in our names, right? What is happening here is an attack on our universities. It's an attack on Jewish people. It is a distortion. It is a misappropriation. And I think that that's powerful when that is said in various different ways. There are groups, there's a group of Jewish faculty members across Boston who have been organizing and leading on this. I have colleagues here at Harvard, again, who have been writing and speaking on this. And I do think that that is powerful. There's a complexity to these issues, to be sure. I'm not trying to flatten that or minimize it. The conflict in the Middle East is challenging and has deep both complexities and histories and also emotion all around it. But also, I think yes, it is valuable for that voice and perspective and that moral authority to be present in the conversation. The second, I will speak specifically to the vast majority of people listening right now who are lawyers, which is to say, there is a role for lawyers in this moment, not just in terms of pressing, your law firms to take stands in the conflict that is within the sort of zone of the attacks on the legal profession, but also in being willing to lend your skills to the fight. Part of my job as general counsel for our chapter is trying to find lawyers to help us in these fights. I feel really lucky that we have two terrific firms that are representing us in the funding fight, representing our chapter. And that we're represented by a great nonprofit and another firm in a separate lawsuit that our chapter filed to try to stop deportations based on ideological grounds, like what happened to Rameza Ozturk right here in our backyard. But I will also tell you, I spend a lot of time talking to lawyers at firms who say, gosh, we really wish we could help you, but this is just too hot button for us. Or a partner who will tell me, I'd love to help you, but I have to take this to the whole partnership committee, and then they come back and say, yeah, sorry, we're keeping our heads down on this one. That's happening across the country, right? Again, you can see reporting of nonprofits that are in the immigration space saying that law firms who used to be their regular go-to pro bono allies are quiet now. There's a moment of fear across the country and across the profession. And I recognize that that's real. The fear is not irrational. This is a scary moment. But it's also a moment that I think we will only get through by recognizing that we need to stand next to each other and with each other and link arms in the fight. And I think that for all the lawyers listening, there's a lot that can be done. There's lots of need, there's lots of opportunity, and that those moments too call for some moral courage, but they're also an opportunity to put to work the tremendous skill that our profession has in trying to insist that this country continues to be a constitutional democracy operating under the rule of law.
Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Crespo. A few last notes for our listeners. Number one, I hope that you'll check in if you want to see our analysis of the administration more broadly. We have a 100 Days podcast that came out last week on our website. Next week, we're going to be having a town hall with 4 states attorneys general from California, Arizona, Minnesota, and Massachusetts. So I hope you'll check that out too. And you might think about joining the Federal Workers Legal Defense Network. ACS has helped with setting that up, and that's a quick volunteer opportunity you can check in with. But whatever you do, hope you'll take away from this conversation and stay engaged, and appreciate y'all and the time. Have a great afternoon.